A rookie cop with a chip on his shoulder walks into a late-night diner, sees two black men in heavy hoodies, and decides they don't belong. He thinks he's asserting dominance. He thinks he's the unquestioned law of the land. What he doesn't know is that the two men he's trying to illegally humiliate and throw out are elite undercover detectives, and he just walked right into the middle of a massive federal sting operation. Stick around, because the karma in this true-to-life story hits like a freight train. The rain in Southside Chicago wasn't just wet, it was aggressive. It lashed against the grease-stained windows of the Silver Skillet Diner, a 24-hour joint that smelled perpetually of old fryer oil, strong black coffee, and desperation. It was 2:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. The diner was mostly empty, save for a long-haul trucker nursing a slice of cherry pie in the corner, and two men sitting in a booth near the back emergency exit. Those two men were Jason Robert and Terrence Rollins. To anyone else in the diner, they looked like trouble. Jason wore a faded, oversized grey hoodie pulled up over a dark beanie. He had a thick, untrimmed beard and a scar that snaked down his jawline, a souvenir from a previous operation that had gone sideways. Terrence, sitting across from him, was built like a linebacker, wearing a scuffed leather jacket over a black t-shirt, his neck adorned with heavy, gaudy silver chains. They looked rough, exhausted, and dangerous, which was exactly the point. Jason and Terrence weren't thugs. They were senior detectives with the Organized Crime Division, currently 5 months deep into Operation Ironclad. They had spent the last 20 weeks infiltrating a notorious weapons trafficking ring run by a man named Arthur Gable. Gable was paranoid, ruthless, and heavily guarded. For months, Jason and Terrence had played the roles of Dez and T-Bone, mid-level buyers from out of state. Tonight was supposed to be the night. Gable's right-hand man was scheduled to meet them at the diner at 2:30 a.m. to finalize the drop location for 24 stolen military-grade firearms. They had wires taped to their chests, burning against their skin. Half a mile away, in an unmarked surveillance van, Captain Thomas Mitchell and a heavily armed tactical team were listening to their every breath, waiting for the signal word, checkmate. "You think Gable's guy is going to show?" Terrence muttered, keeping his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes scanning the diner's entrance. "He'll show," Jason replied, taking a sip of the scalding, bitter coffee. "Gable is greedy. He wants this money moved before the end of the month. Just stay loose. The moment he gives us the address for the lockup, we drop the word. Mitchell moves in, and we can finally go home and sleep for a week." Terrence let out a low, gravelly chuckle. "Man, I haven't seen my wife in 3 days. I smell like stale cigarettes and cheap bourbon. If this doesn't go down tonight, I might lose my mind." As Terrence finished his sentence, the bells above the diner's front door chimed. The wind howled briefly before the heavy glass door was shoved shut. But it wasn't Gable's man. It was Officer Brendan Fowler. Fowler was a 2-year patrolman with the local precinct, notorious among his peers for his explosive temper and a desperate need to prove himself. He was the kind of cop who watched too many action movies, treating his badge not as a shield for the public, but as a crown for himself. He wore his uniform tight, his utility belt weighed down with every tactical gadget he could order online. Water dripped from his slicked-back hair as he shook off the rain and swaggered into the diner. Brenda, the graveyard shift waitress who had worked at the Skillet for 15 years, immediately straightened up. "Evening, Officer Fowler." "The usual." "Yeah, Brenda. Black coffee." "To go." Fowler barked, not looking at her. His pale blue eyes were already sweeping the room, doing what he called a threat assessment. He dismissed the trucker instantly. Then his gaze locked onto the back booth. Jason felt the stare immediately. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He didn't turn his head, but he tapped Terence's boot under the table. "We got a uniform clocking us," Jason murmured, his lips barely moving. Terence kept his eyes on his coffee mug. "Ignore him. We look the part. Let him look." But Fowler wasn't just looking. In his mind, he had already painted a picture. Two black men, dressed like street enforcers, sitting in the back of a diner at 2:15 a.m. in a high-crime neighborhood. To Fowler, they weren't customers. They were targets. He didn't see two men drinking coffee. He saw an opportunity to make a scene, to assert his authority, and to clear out the trash from his beat. Fowler grabbed his steaming paper cup from the counter. Instead of heading back out into the rain, he adjusted his duty belt, puffed out his chest, and began a slow, deliberate march down the narrow aisle of the diner, heading straight for the back booth. "Jason," Terence whispered, catching the reflection of the approaching officer in the diner's window. "He's coming over. Keep it cool," Jason replied smoothly. "Do not break character. We are Dez and T-Bone. We don't like cops, but we don't want trouble. Do not blow this op." In the surveillance van down the street, Captain Mitchell leaned closer to the audio receiver. "What's going on in there, boys?" he muttered into his headset, hearing the heavy, squeaking footsteps of Fowler's boots drawing closer to his undercover detectives. "Who just walked in?" Back in the diner, Fowler stopped right at the edge of their booth. He stood far too close, invading their personal space, his hand resting casually, but intentionally, on the butt of his sidearm. "Gentlemen," Fowler said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You boys lost?" Jason slowly looked up from his coffee, channeling every ounce of Dez, the weary, street-smart buyer. He gave Fowler a blank, unamused stare. "We're having coffee, officer," Jason said, his voice a low, steady baritone. "Just waiting for a friend." Fowler smirked, a cruel twisting of his lips. "Waiting for a friend? At 2 a.m, in a place like this? You don't look like you're from around here." "Didn't realize it was a crime to buy a cup of coffee outside my zip code," Terence chimed in, leaning back in the vinyl booth, crossing his massive arms. He kept his tone flat, deliberately unimpressed. Fowler's jaw tightened. He didn't like pushback. He expected deference. He expected fear. The complete lack of intimidation from these two men infuriated him instantly. "I didn't ask for your lip, big guy," Fowler snapped, leaning over the table. "I asked what you're doing here. There's been a string of burglaries in this commercial district. You two match the description of a couple of suspects we're looking for." It was a blatant lie. Jason knew the dispatch logs. There hadn't been a commercial burglary in this sector in 3 weeks. Fowler was fishing, using a fabricated excuse to initiate a Terry stop, a detainment based on reasonable suspicion. "Must be a popular description," Jason said smoothly. "But we've been sitting in this booth for 45 minutes. Brenda poured our coffee. You can ask her. We haven't burgled anything except this stale blueberry muffin." Jason pointed to the half-eaten pastry on a tiny ceramic plate. Down the street in the van, Captain Mitchell's voice crackled slightly in Jason's earpiece. "Who is this uniform? Robert, defuse it. Gable's man is 3 minutes out. Get this beat cop out of your face right now." Jason knew the stakes. If Gable's enforcer walked through that door and saw them talking to a uniformed police officer, the multi-million-dollar deal was dead. Worse, Gable would assume they were informants, putting a target on their backs for the rest of their lives. "Look, officer," Jason glanced at the name tag. "Fowler. We're just finishing up here. We don't want any trouble. We'll drink our coffee and be on our way soon." It was a polite dismissal, an off-ramp for the officer to take, but Fowler's ego was already bruised. "You'll be on your way right now," Fowler demanded, his voice rising in volume, echoing off the diner's tiled walls. The trucker in the corner nervously threw a $5 bill on the table and hurried out the door into the rain. "Excuse me?" Terence said, his undercover persona flaring up slightly. "We paid for our food. We're waiting for someone. We have a right to sit here." "Not when I tell you to leave," Fowler barked. "This is private property, and I'm officially trespassing you on behalf of the management. Let's see some ID, both of you. Right now." Jason's mind raced. Their undercover IDs were flawless fakes. Desmond Vance and Tyrone Rollins, with fake addresses and dummy background checks. But handing them over meant Fowler would run them through dispatch. It would take time. Time they didn't have. Gable's man was practically pulling into the parking lot. "Officer Fowler," Jason said, keeping his hands flat and visible on the table. "We haven't committed a crime. We are paying customers. Unless the manager of this establishment specifically asks us to leave, you have no legal authority to trespass us." Fowler's face turned violently red. He wasn't used to street guys knowing case law. "I am the law in this sector. Stand up. Both of you. Stand the hell up, face the wall, and hand over your IDs, or I am dragging you out of this booth by your necks." In the back, Brenda the waitress gasped, dropping a handful of silverware into a plastic tub with a loud clatter. "Fowler, you're stepping over a line," Terence warned, his voice dropping an octave, the authority of a seasoned detective briefly slipping through the street thug facade. "Walk away. You don't know what you're interfering with." It was the wrong thing to say. To Fowler, it sounded like a threat. Fowler unclipped the retention strap on his holster. He didn't draw his weapon, but his hand gripped the handle tightly. "Are you threatening a police officer? Is that what's happening here?" "Robert Rollins, do not blow your cover," Captain Mitchell's voice barked frantically through the hidden earpieces. "I am pulling up the patrol schedule. I'm getting Fowler's shift sergeant on the radio right now. Stall him. Just stall him for 60 seconds. "Nobody is threatening anyone, Brendan," Jason said, intentionally using the cop's first name to try and jar him out of his power trip. "Take a breath. Look around. We are drinking coffee. We have no weapons visible. We are not a threat to you. Just go back to your patrol car." "Stand up!" Fowler screamed, spit flying from his lips, completely losing control of his emotions. He grabbed his shoulder mic. "Dispatch. This is Unit 4 Bravo. I have 2 non-compliant suspects at the Silver Skillet. Requesting backup. Code 3. Jason and Terence exchanged a fleeting, horrified glance. Code 3 meant lights and sirens. In less than 2 minutes, the diner was going to be swarming with black and whites. The sting operation was collapsing in real time because of one racist, power-tripping rookie. "Cancel that call, Fowler," Terence said, his tone no longer playing a role. It was the commanding voice of a senior detective. "Cancel it right now. You are making a massive mistake." "Shut your mouth," Fowler snapped. Without warning, he reached across the table, grabbed the front of Jason's hoodie, and yanked him hard. Jason's instincts, honed from 2 tours in Afghanistan and a decade on the streets, flared. In a fraction of a second, his hand shot up, locking around Fowler's wrist with a grip like a steel vice. He didn't strike the officer, but he stopped the physical assault cold. Fowler's eyes widened in shock. The thug had just effortlessly neutralized his grab. "Let go of me, you son of a bitch!" Fowler yelled, panic lacing his voice as he realized how strong the man sitting across from him was. He tried to pull his arm back, but Jason held it firmly in place on the table. "Listen to me very carefully," Jason said, his voice deathly quiet, piercing through the diner's silence. "I am going to let go of your wrist. When I do, you are going to take 2 steps back. You are not going to draw your weapon, and you are not going to touch me again. Do you understand?" Fowler was hyperventilating now, humiliated and enraged. "Assault on an officer. You're going to prison for this." Jason slowly released Fowler's wrist and raised both hands in the air, showing his palms. Terence did the same, keeping his hands clearly visible on the table. At that exact moment, a sleek black Mercedes slowly rolled past the diner's front window. Through the rain-slicked glass, Jason saw the driver. It was Marcus, Gable's enforcer. Marcus took one look at the scene inside. A uniformed cop aggressively hovering over Dez and T-Bone, reaching for his cuffs. The Mercedes didn't even tap its brakes. It accelerated smoothly, disappearing down the dark, rain-soaked avenue. Jason closed his eyes for a split second. 5 months. 5 months of risking his life, of lying to his family, of living in filth, all completely erased in 30 seconds by a rookie with a god complex. "He's gone," Terence whispered, seeing the Mercedes drive off. The devastation in his voice was palpable. In the surveillance van, Captain Mitchell slammed his fist into the metal console. "Operation is blown. I repeat, Ironclad is blown. All units, stand down on the Gable drop. Move in to secure the diner. Get that idiot patrolman out of there before I rip his badge off myself." Ignorant of the destruction he had just caused, Fowler pulled his handcuffs from his belt. "Get out of the booth. Hands behind your back. Both of you." "Officer Fowler," Jason said, his undercover persona melting away entirely. His posture straightened, his grammar sharpened. "You have no probable cause for an arrest. You have fabricated reasonable suspicion. You have laid hands on me without legal justification. I am politely advising you to put your handcuffs away and step back." Fowler laughed, a harsh, hysterical sound. "You're advising me. A street thug is advising me on the law. Turn around before I tase you until you wet yourself." "Fowler, look at my face," Terence said, leaning forward into the light. "Look closely. You've been on the force 2 years. You work out of the 14th Precinct. Your shift commander is Sergeant Bill Halliard. The union rep you cry to every time you get written up for a bad stop is Tommy Sullivan." Fowler froze, his handcuffs dangling from his fingers. The blood slowly drained from his face. How did this street thug know the names of his commanding officers? How did he know about his internal affairs write-ups? Who told you that?" Fowler stammered, taking a half-step back, his hand wavering near his taser. "Nobody told me," Terence said coldly, slowly reaching his hand toward the inside of his leather jacket. "Hands where I can see them!" Fowler shrieked, instantly drawing his firearm and pointing it directly at Terence's chest. "Pull it out slow. 2 fingers!" Brenda screamed from behind the counter and ducked below the register. Terence didn't flinch. He didn't panic. He looked down the barrel of the 9mm Glock with the bored annoyance of a man who had faced much deadlier weapons wielded by much smarter men. Using exactly 2 fingers, Terence reached into his inner pocket. He didn't pull out a gun. He didn't pull out a knife. He pulled out a heavy, gold-plated shield encased in black leather. He tossed it onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud next to the half-eaten blueberry muffin. Fowler's eyes darted down to the table. The words stamped onto the metal seemed to burn into his retinas. Detective, Organized Crime Division, City of Chicago. "I'm Detective Terence Rollins," Terence said, his voice echoing like thunder in the quiet diner. He pointed to Jason. "This is Senior Detective Jason Robert, and you, Officer Fowler, have just ruined a $2 million federal narcotics and weapons sting." Fowler stood paralyzed. His gun was still drawn, but his arms began to shake violently. His brain short-circuited, unable to process the horrific reality of the hole he had just dug for himself. Before Fowler could say a single word, the diner's front doors exploded open. 5 men in heavy tactical gear, wearing bulletproof vests emblazoned with police, swarmed into the restaurant. Leading them was Captain Mitchell, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Mitchell walked straight up to Fowler, slapped the barrel of Fowler's drawn gun down toward the floor, and got so close to the rookie's face that their noses almost touched. "Holster your weapon, officer," Mitchell whispered, his voice trembling with a rage so profound it terrified Fowler more than any shouting could. "Holster it right now, before I arrest you for aggravated assault on a police officer." Fowler clumsily shoved his gun back into its holster, his hands shaking so badly he missed the clasp twice. "Captain, I thought they were—" "You thought what?" Jason said, finally sliding out of the booth, standing up to his full height. He towered over Fowler. "You thought you could walk in here and bully two black men because you got a badge from a crackerjack box and a complex about your manhood." "I was doing my job," Fowler squeaked, a desperate, pathetic defense mechanisms kicking in. "They looked suspicious. They looked like my best undercover operatives," Mitchell roared, finally losing his composure. "They have been living in hell for 5 months to get illegal automatic weapons off the streets, the same streets you pretend to patrol, and you just blew it because you wanted to play tough guy in a diner." The tactical team had already secured the perimeter. The wail of approaching sirens, the backup Fowler had called, could be heard in the distance. Mitchell turned to one of his tactical officers. "Go out there and intercept those patrol cars. Tell them the scene is secure. I do not want any of Fowler's friends coming in here and seeing this embarrassment." He turned back to the trembling rookie. "Officer Fowler," Mitchell said coldly, "give me your badge and your gun. Right now." "My badge?" Officer Brendan Fowler stammered, his voice cracking like a terrified teenager's. The diner was dead silent except for the heavy drumming of rain against the glass and the low, rhythmic squawk of police radios. "Captain Mitchell, sir, You can't do that. I have union representation. I was conducting a lawful investigative stop based on— If you finish that sentence with reasonable suspicion, I am going to have my men cuff you to the deep fryer," Captain Mitchell interrupted, his voice dropping to a terrifying, icy calm. He held out his hand, palm up. "You just drew a loaded firearm on a senior detective of the Organized Crime Division. You jeopardized the lives of 2 federal task force operatives. You obstructed a multi-agency sting operation. I am not asking you, Officer Fowler. I am giving you a direct, lawful order. Disarm, now." The color completely vanished from Fowler's face. He looked wildly around the diner, desperately seeking a friendly face, a sympathetic eye. He found none. The 5 tactical officers surrounding the booth stared at him with unmasked disgust. The thin, blue line didn't protect cops who pulled guns on their own, especially not rookies who did it out of sheer, arrogant incompetence. Trembling uncontrollably, Fowler unbuckled his heavy duty belt. The leather creaked loudly in the quiet room. He unclipped his radio, then his badge from his chest, and finally, he handed over his service weapon. Mitchell snatched the Glock, expertly cleared the chamber, and handed it to one of the tactical officers. "Officer Jenkins," Mitchell barked to a burly tactical unit member, standing near the door. "Escort Mr. Fowler to my vehicle. Put him in the back. Do not let him speak to anyone." Fowler opened his mouth to protest, but Jenkins grabbed him firmly by the bicep. The grip was tight, a clear physical message to comply. Fowler, stripped of his belt, his gun, and his badge, suddenly looked incredibly small. His uniform, which he wore like a superhero cape just 10 minutes prior, now looked like a costume that was 2 sizes too big. As Fowler was marched down the narrow aisle toward the front doors, he had to pass Brenda, the waitress. She was standing up behind the counter now, wiping her hands on her apron. She didn't say a word, but the look of absolute pity and judgment in her eyes was the final nail in Fowler's ego. He looked down at the linoleum floor and let Jenkins push him out into the freezing rain. Back at the booth, Jason Robert and Terence Rollins didn't celebrate. There was no high-fiving. There was only a crushing, suffocating silence. Terence let out a long, ragged exhale, and rubbed his hands over his face. He reached under his heavy leather jacket and began aggressively tearing at the medical tape, holding the microphone wire to his chest. He winced as the adhesive pulled at his skin, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the professional agony. 5 months, Dave, Terence whispered, staring at the tangled black wire in his hands. 5 months eating garbage, sleeping in roach-infested motels, lying to my wife about where I am. We had Gable. We had him. Jason stared out the window into the darkness, where the Mercedes had disappeared. His jaw was clenched so tightly his teeth ached. I know, T. I know. Captain Mitchell slid into the booth where Fowler had just stood, sighing heavily. Are you two okay? Did he hurt you? My pride is bruised, Cap, Jason muttered, finally turning away from the window. But I'm fine. T is fine. But Gable is in the wind. Marcus saw the uniform. He saw the commotion. By tomorrow morning, the word on the street is going to be that Dez and T-Bone were either busted or they're informants. We can never use these identities again. The weapons drop? Mitchell asked, knowing the answer but needing to hear it. Gone, Terence said bitterly. 24 military-grade rifles are going to hit the streets of Chicago because a rookie cop didn't like the color of our skin and the cut of our hoodies. Mitchell nodded slowly, his expression hardening. Pack up your gear. Get back to the precinct. Take the next 3 days off. Go see your families. And what about Fowler? Jason asked, his eyes narrowing. He's going to hide behind the Union. He's going to say he acted in good faith. You know how this goes, Cap. A slap on the wrist, a 2-week paid suspension, and he'll be back on patrol harassing teenagers. Mitchell stood up, his posture rigid. Not this time, Jason. This time, he didn't just harass a civilian. He interfered with a joint federal task force. He pulled a gun on a superior officer. I am personally going to make sure Brendan Fowler never wears a uniform again. I'm taking this straight to internal affairs, and then I'm calling the feds. The next morning, the 14th precinct was a hornet's nest of rumors and hushed conversations. Word had spread through the locker rooms like wildfire. Fowler pulled a gun on undercover OCD detectives, sitting in a sterile, windowless interrogation room in the basement of the precinct. Brendan Fowler was trying to reclaim his bravado. Across the metal table sat Tommy Sullivan, the precinct's union representative. Sullivan was a grizzled, cynical man who had spent 20 years defending cops from bad decisions. But even Sullivan looked incredibly stressed, rubbing his temples as he reviewed the preliminary report. Okay, Brendan, let's go over this one more time, Sullivan said, his voice gravelly from years of chain smoking. Internal Affairs is going to walk through that door in about 2 minutes. You need a rock-solid narrative. Why did you approach the suspects? Fowler leaned forward, adopting a practiced look of earnest dedication. I was doing a routine commercial check. I noticed 2 males matching the description of suspects from a string of burglaries. They were wearing heavy clothing, hoodies and leather jackets, despite the diner being heated. They were acting evasive. I initiated a standard Terry stop. And the escalation? Sullivan pressed. They were non-compliant, Fowler lied smoothly. They refused to identify themselves. The suspect in the hoodie, Robert, grabbed my wrist violently. I felt my safety was in immediate jeopardy. I unholstered my weapon to gain compliance. That's when the other suspect produced a badge. I stood down immediately. Sullivan sighed, tapping his pen against the table. It's a stretch, Brendan. You had no backup. You escalated a simple AD refusal into a physical confrontation, and you drew a lethal weapon on an unarmed man. But we can spin the officer safety angle. We can say you were in a high-stress environment and made a split-second judgment call. Best-case scenario, a 30-day suspension and retraining. Fowler smirked slightly, the arrogance bleeding back into his eyes. "I can handle a 30-day vacation. Just get me out of here, Tommy." The heavy metal door clicked open, but it wasn't a local internal affairs detective who walked in. It was a woman in a sharp, tailored navy pantsuit, carrying a thick manila folder. Behind her was Captain Mitchell, looking more dangerous than he had the night before. The woman sat down opposite Fowler and placed the folder on the table. She didn't smile. "Officer Fowler, Mr. Sullivan, I am Special Agent Corinne Vance with the Federal Bureau of Investigation," she said, her voice crisp and authoritative. Fowler's smirk vanished. Sullivan dropped his pen. "FBI?" Sullivan asked, sitting up straight. "Hold on a second. This is an internal precinct matter regarding a use of force complaint. The Bureau has no jurisdiction here." Agent Vance opened the folder. "Actually, Mr. Sullivan, we have absolute jurisdiction. Last night, your client deliberately interfered with Operation Ironclad, a joint FBI and Chicago PD sting targeting interstate weapons trafficking. Officer Fowler's actions directly resulted in the loss of federal targets and the escape of 24 stolen military firearms." Fowler swallowed hard, his throat suddenly bone dry. I didn't know they were undercover. They looked like gangbangers. I was enforcing the law." "You were fabricating probable cause," Vance corrected him sharply. "But we don't have to rely on your version of events, Officer Fowler. Do you know how federal sting operations work?" Fowler stared at her blankly, a cold knot forming in his stomach. "When our undercover operatives are in the field," Vance continued, leaning forward, "they wear state-of-the-art surveillance equipment. To ensure the safety of our agents and the legal integrity of our prosecutions, they are wired for continuous audio. And because this was a federal operation, the recording equipment isn't the cheap radio mics you guys use on patrol." Agent Vance reached into her pocket and pulled out a small digital audio player. She placed it on the metal table and pressed play. The audio was horrifyingly clear. "Gentlemen, you boys lost?" Fowler's condescending sneer echoed in the small room. "We're having coffee, officer, just waiting for a friend," Jason's voice replied calmly. The recording played out the entire interaction. Every fabricated excuse, every polite attempt by Jason and Terrence to de-escalate, every aggressive, unhinged threat made by Fowler. It captured Fowler demanding they leave private property without the manager's consent. It captured the terrifying physical scuffle. "Shut your mouth!" The audio caught the sound of fabric ripping as Fowler grabbed Jason's hoodie. "Let go of me, you son of a bitch!" Fowler's own panicked, cowardly voice filled the room. Agent Vance pressed pause. The silence in the interrogation room was deafening. Tommy Sullivan slowly pushed his chair back away from the table, physically distancing himself from Fowler. He looked at the rookie cop not with a union rep's solidarity, but with the disgust of a professional who knew a lost cause when he saw one. "You lied to me, Brendan," Sullivan muttered. "You told me he grabbed you. The audio proves you assaulted him first. You escalated the entire thing." "Tommy, please!" Fowler begged, his voice cracking. "I'm done," Sullivan said, standing up. He looked at Captain Mitchell and Agent Vance. "The Union is withdrawing representation. He's on his own." Sullivan walked out of the room, slamming the heavy metal door behind him. Fowler was completely alone. The reality of his situation crashed down on him like a collapsing building. "Officer Fowler," Agent Vance said, her eyes devoid of any sympathy, "you aren't facing an internal affairs review for a bad stop. You are being federally indicted." Fowler's breath hitched. "Indicted? For what?" "Deprivation of civil rights under color of law," Vance listed smoothly. "Aggravated assault on a federal task force officer, and obstruction of a federal investigation. We are looking at a minimum of 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Captain Mitchell leaned over the table, finally getting the closure he desperately needed. You thought you could walk into a diner and bully two men because you held all the power. You thought the badge gave you a blank check to treat people like dirt. Mitchell tapped the digital recorder. You picked the wrong diner. You picked the wrong men. And now you are going to pay for it for the rest of your life. The swiftness with which justice moved against Brendan Fowler was breathtaking, a crushing avalanche that buried his career, his reputation, and his freedom in a matter of days. Within 48 hours of the diner incident, the Chicago Police Department didn't just suspend him, they fast-tracked his termination with an absolute, terrifying efficiency. The police union, heavily fortified against most administrative complaints, took one look at the federal indictments and the irrefutable audio evidence and completely washed their hands of him. Fowler went from a cocky, uniformed patrolman who believed he owned the streets to an unemployed, disgraced civilian facing the terrifying, unblinking wrath of the United States Department of Justice. For Fowler, the isolation was immediate and suffocating. He retreated to his cramped, one-bedroom apartment, pulling the blinds tight against the flashing cameras of the local press. The media had caught wind of the story within a week, and the headlines were relentless. They painted a vivid, undeniable picture of a rogue, prejudiced cop who had let his own racial bias and staggering ego destroy a multi-million-dollar federal sting. Protesters gathered outside the 14th precinct, demanding sweeping accountability, while news helicopters circled Dirksen Federal Courthouse downtown. Fowler's phone stopped ringing. The colleagues he thought were his brothers in blue deleted his number. He was entirely, profoundly alone. But behind the scenes, far from the media circus, Captain Thomas Mitchell and the FBI were utilizing this exact public outrage to their absolute tactical advantage. Arthur Gable, the ruthless weapons trafficker Jason and Terrence had spent 5 agonizing months tracking, was incredibly paranoid. When his lead enforcer had driven past the Silver Skillet diner and seen a uniformed police officer aggressively detaining Dez and T-Bone, Gable had immediately assumed the worst. He believed his buyers were either confidential informants wearing wires, or they were sloppy amateurs who had brought too much heat to his doorstep. Following protocol, Gable cut all communication. The drop was cancelled. The operation, for all intents and purposes, was presumed dead. However, criminals of Gable's caliber read the news too. They monitored police scanners, they watched local broadcasts, and they paid attention to the shifting tides of law enforcement. When the federal indictments dropped against Fowler, it became high-profile public knowledge that the rookie cop had gone completely off the reservation. The local news stations broadcasted the narrative heavily, exactly as the FBI wanted them to. A rogue, racist officer targets 2 innocent men in a late-night diner, resulting in a shocking federal civil rights indictment. In a secure, windowless briefing room at FBI headquarters, Assistant United States Attorney Benjamin Caldwell laid out the strategy. Caldwell was a veteran, razor-sharp prosecutor who intentionally kept the full details of Operation Ironclad heavily sealed under judicial order. He fed the press just enough inflammatory information to humiliate Fowler without ever exposing Jason and Terrence's true law enforcement identities to the public. Gable is watching the news, Captain Mitchell told his heavily armed task force, pointing to a corkboard plastered with surveillance photos of the weapons kingpin. He sees that the Chicago Police Department is currently tearing itself apart over this rookie's massive, unforgivable blunder. More importantly, he sees that Dez and T-Bone are being painted exclusively as victims of civil rights violations, not federal agents. This is our smokescreen. This is our window. Gable is paranoid, but he is equally greedy. The moment he feels comfortable that the police heat was an isolated incident of local incompetence, a rogue cop acting alone, he will try to move those stolen weapons again. Meanwhile, Brendan Fowler's life was systematically and mercilessly dismantled in federal court. The trial was brief, brutal, and entirely one-sided. A USA Caldwell had zero tolerance for officers who betrayed the badge, and he approached the prosecution not just as a legal proceeding, but as a public execution of Fowler's character. He didn't just want a conviction, he wanted to make a profound, inescapable example out of Fowler for any other officer who thought the uniform granted them a license to abuse. Fowler sat at the defense table, his expensive, tailored suit hanging loosely on his rapidly thinning frame. The arrogant smirk that had once been permanently plastered across his face was completely gone, replaced by hollow, terrified eyes that darted around the mahogany-paneled courtroom. His high-priced private defense attorney, Richard Lawson, tried desperately to argue the heat of the moment defense. Lawson paced in front of the jury, claiming Fowler was an inexperienced officer, acting under the severe stress of patrolling a high-crime area, suggesting that the undercover officer's refusal to immediately identify themselves contributed to a tragic but non-criminal misunderstanding. A USA Caldwell destroyed that defense in under 10 minutes. He didn't rely on witness testimony alone. He let Fowler hang himself with his own words. Caldwell introduced the digital audio recording from the wire taped to Jason's chest and played it for the jury over the courtroom's premium sound system. "You'll be on your way right now. This is private property, and I'm officially trespassing you. Let's see some ID, both of you. Right now." The courtroom listened in dead, breathless silence as the pristine audio captured Fowler's completely unprovoked escalation. They heard his vicious verbal abuse, his fabricated legal claims, and finally, the terrifying physical altercation where he drew a loaded weapon on an unarmed, fully compliant man. The jury heard the quiet, disciplined, and measured professionalism of Jason Robert and Terrence Rollins, beautifully juxtaposed against the unhinged, frantic, and tyrannical screaming of a power-tripping rookie. To completely seal the coffin, Caldwell called Brenda, the graveyard shift waitress, to the stand. Brenda was a working-class citizen, nervous but resolute. She adjusted the microphone and looked directly at the jury, refusing to look at Fowler. "Those two men were just drinking coffee," Brenda testified, her voice steady and echoing clearly in the silent room. "They were polite to me. They paid their bill." Officer Fowler walked in like he owned the building, looking for a fight. He didn't care about the law. He didn't care if they had done anything wrong. He just saw two black men minding their own business, and he wanted to humiliate them. He pulled a gun over a cup of coffee. Fowler buried his face in his trembling hands. His attorney stopped taking notes. It was an absolute massacre. As the trial reached its closing arguments, captivating the entire city's attention, Jason and Terrence weren't even in the courtroom. They hadn't been subpoenaed to testify publicly, keeping their faces off the evening news. Instead, they were back on the grim, rain-swept streets of the South Side, wearing their heavy hoodies and scuffed leather jackets, waiting in an unmarked surveillance van. The smokescreen had worked flawlessly. 3 weeks into Fowler's highly publicized trial, just as the jury was preparing to deliberate, Arthur Gable's paranoia finally gave way to his overwhelming greed. The 24 stolen military rifles were burning a massive hole in his pocket. His out-of-state buyers were getting dangerously impatient, and the news cycle had convinced him that the diner incident was nothing more than a lucky break involving a bad cop. Sitting in the dim glow of the van's tactical monitors in an industrial park on the edge of the city, Jason Roberts' encrypted burner phone suddenly began to buzz. The screen lit up with an unsaved number. Jason looked at the caller ID, his heart slamming against his ribs. He looked over at Terrence, who was already tightening the straps on his Kevlar vest. A sharp, predatory grin spread across Jason's face. "Des here," Jason answered, his voice dropping an octave, slipping effortlessly back into his weary, street-smart, undercover persona. The diner was a total mess, Des. The gravelly, unmistakable voice of Arthur Gable echoed through the phone's small speaker. You boys got incredibly lucky with that rogue cop making the evening news. It looks like you're just a couple of victims now. Tell me you still have the capital for the hardware. Jason caught Captain Mitchell's eye through the rearview mirror. Mitchell gave a single, firm nod. We got the capital, Arthur, Jason said smoothly, projecting absolute confidence. But we ain't meeting at no public diner this time. You pick the spot. Dark and quiet. We move the money tonight, or we walk away for good. Midnight? Gable replied, the greed thick in his voice. Abandoned rail yard off 47th. Come alone. If I see a single flashing light, you're both dead. The line clicked dead. The hook was set. The rain had returned to Chicago, washing the gritty streets of the industrial sector in a cold, unforgiving downpour. It was 11:45 p.m. The abandoned rail yard off 47th Street was a graveyard of rusted boxcars and shattered glass, illuminated only by the distant, sickly orange glow of sodium streetlights. This time, the operation was not going to be left to chance. While Jason and Terrence drove into the heart of the yard in a battered Chevrolet Tahoe, over 40 federal agents and CPD SWAT officers were silently forming an iron ring around the perimeter. Night vision goggles hummed. Snipers took positions on the roofs of the surrounding derelict warehouses. Captain Mitchell sat in the mobile command center, his eyes glued to the thermal imaging screens, watching the trap finally snap shut. Arthur Gable didn't send his enforcer this time. He came himself. A heavy, armored transport truck rumbled into the clearing, flanked by two black SUVs. Gable, a towering man in a thick wool overcoat, stepped out into the rain. He was flanked by 4 heavily armed guards, carrying short-barreled shotguns. Jason and Terrence stepped out of their Tahoe. They didn't show an ounce of fear. They walked up to Gable, the tension in the air thick enough to choke on. "Show me the money, Des," Gable demanded, rain dripping from his nose. Terrence opened the trunk of the Tahoe and unzipped a massive canvas duffel bag, revealing bundles of marked, non-sequential $100 bills. $2 million in cold, hard federal bait. Gable's eyes lit up with absolute greed. He nodded to his men. They walked to the back of the transport truck and threw open the heavy steel doors. Inside were wooden crates stamped with military serial numbers. 24 M4 carbines, fully automatic, Gable said, patting the side of the truck. Brand new. Untraceable. Jason reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out his wallet. He keyed the hidden transmitter taped to his collarbone. "The hardware is verified," Jason said loudly. "I repeat, the hardware is verified. Checkmate." Before Gable could even register the words, the night exploded. Blinding, million-candle power spotlights erupted from the darkness, washing the rail yard in daylight. Flashbang grenades detonated with deafening cracks, disorienting Gable's guards instantly. From every shadow, from every rusted boxcar, heavily armed SWAT operators poured into the clearing. "Federal agents, drop your weapons! Get on the ground!" The voice over the tactical bullhorn was deafening. Gable's men, blinded and outnumbered 50-1, instantly dropped their shotguns and fell to their knees. Gable himself tried to run toward his SUV, but Terrence was faster. The massive undercover detective tackled the weapons kingpin into the freezing mud, pinning his arms behind his back with bone-crushing force. "Arthur Gable," Terrence growled, locking the heavy steel handcuffs around the man's wrists. "You are under arrest for federal weapons trafficking. The game is over." Jason stood in the rain, watching the SWAT team secure the military-grade rifles. He let out a long, ragged breath. The weight of the last 6 months finally lifting from his shoulders. The Operation Ironclad seizure list. 24 military-grade M4 carbines, fully automatic, 12 suppressors and tactical optics, 15,000 rounds of 5.56mm ammunition, 7 high-level organized crime syndicate members, arrested. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds over Chicago. Inside Dirksen Federal Courthouse, the atmosphere was solemn, heavy, and final. It was sentencing day for Brendan Fowler. Fowler stood before United States District Judge Arthur Harrison. He was no longer wearing his tailored suit. He was wearing a bright orange jumpsuit issued by the Metropolitan Correctional Center. His wrists and ankles were shackled. He looked broken, a pale ghost of the man who had swaggered into the Silver Skillet diner. Judge Harrison looked down at the disgraced officer with an expression of profound, unyielding disappointment. "Mr. Fowler," Judge Harrison began, his voice echoing through the packed courtroom, "law enforcement officers are granted extraordinary powers by the citizens they serve. The power to detain, the power to arrest, the power to use lethal force. That power is a sacred trust. It requires humility, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to the Constitution." The judge leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "You entirely lacked all of these traits. You used your badge not as a shield to protect the vulnerable, but as a weapon to terrorize them. You targeted 2 innocent men purely based on your own racial prejudice and arrogant ego. In doing so, you did not just humiliate yourself, you betrayed every honest, hard-working police officer who wears the uniform. You placed the lives of federal operatives in extreme jeopardy. You are not a victim of circumstance, Mr. Fowler. You are the architect of your own destruction." Fowler sobbed quietly, his head bowed, the chains around his ankles clinking softly as his legs trembled. On the charges of deprivation, of rights under color of law and assault on a federal officer, Judge Harrison decreed, striking his gavel, "I sentence you to 144 months in a federal penitentiary, to be followed by 5 years of supervised release. You are remanded into the custody of the United States Marshals." 12 years. Brendan Fowler was led out of the courtroom in chains. His final destination was the Federal Correctional Institution in Terre Haute, Indiana, a brutal maximum security facility where former police officers were treated with terrifying hostility by the general population. The karma train had not just hit him, it had completely derailed his life. Across town, in the bright, polished hallway of the 14th Precinct, the atmosphere was vastly different. Captain Mitchell stood proudly before a podium, addressing the press corps and local government officials. Standing next to him, wearing sharp, formal dress uniforms adorned with gleaming medals, were Detectives Jason Robert and Terrence Rollins. They were no longer Des and T-Bone. They were heroes. "Today," Captain Mitchell announced, "we celebrate the successful conclusion of Operation Ironclad. Thanks to the unparalleled bravery, immense discipline, and incredible sacrifice of Detectives Robert and Rollins, one of the most dangerous weapons trafficking rings in the Midwest has been entirely dismantled." Jason and Terrence exchanged a brief, knowing look as the room erupted into applause. They had survived the streets, they had survived the cartel, and they had survived the ultimate betrayal from one of their own. Justice had moved in mysterious, complicated ways. But in the end, the scales were perfectly balanced. The bad guys were in handcuffs, the stolen guns were locked in a federal vault, and the racist bully who tried to play God was staring down a decade behind bars. It was a good day to be a detective. True justice isn't always swift, but when it arrives, it leaves no stone unturned. Brendan Fowler thought his badge gave him the ultimate authority to bully and intimidate those he deemed beneath him. Instead, his arrogance, unmasked an undercover federal sting, exposed his own deep-seated bigotry, and ultimately cost him his career, his freedom, and his reputation. Jason Robert and Terrence Rollins proved that true authority doesn't come from yelling or pulling a gun. It comes from discipline, courage, and a relentless pursuit of the truth. Karma always collects its debts, and for Officer Fowler, the price was everything he had. If this story of undercover courage and real-life karma kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share it with your friends to spread the message, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible true crime and justice stories.